Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to telling you about some of my research, and I hope we have time for some conversation as well. As the title indicates, I'll be talking about electronic surveillance of workers from a psychological perspective. This is obviously a topic that many policymakers and members of civil society are very concerned about, and rightly so. I want to approach this from a behavioral and psychological lens to think about how we might advise those policymakers. So I will attempt to move my slides. Here we are. So I think it's a fairly obvious point at this moment in history that technology has changed the world of work. And it's sort of beyond the scope of one talk to discuss all of these changes. The change that I want to talk about today is this sort of omnipresent surveillance that workers are experiencing. I think it's especially noteworthy that the workers with the least power are experiencing the most intense surveillance, and that this is just another way that their power is being taken away from them. To put some context around what I'm talking about as far as what do I mean by monitored electronically or surveilled, in 1980s, 1990s, when this research area began, surveillance meant things like installing video cameras in public areas of an office, or using a keystroke logger to track what a worker was typing or whether they were present or absent. The new versions of these concepts involve tracking someone's voice, listening to how they're speaking to a customer or who they are talking to. It can involve location monitoring through GPS or RFID tags. It can involve physiological sensors that track heart rate or eye movements. And it can also involve remote computer access. Remote workers who are encouraged strongly to leave their cameras on while they're working remotely, for example, would be classified under this category of electronic surveillance. Another thing to note here is that big data analyses of any sort require digital data collection. So this data collection might be happening not because we want to monitor any particular individual's performance, but because we want to collect data to train algorithms for later use or to identify larger patterns. Unfortunately, a worker might not understand or know what the data is being collected for, which is a serious source of stress and uncertainty, unneededly so. We see these headlines reflecting some of the concerns that people have about monitoring, unblinking eyes, sort of invoking this big brother language of surveillance states, that workplaces are becoming surveillance states. In 2021, these headlines have become even more intense. In the last year, the technologies that are sold to employers have increased 600%. And it's not difficult to imagine why. It's because everyone who has suddenly been classified as a remote worker, their bosses don't know how to manage their performance remotely. And so they lean too heavily on these surveillance tools. They think, if I can't see the person working, I cannot give them effective feedback. And so I need some sort of technological solution to find out what they're doing when I'm not physically present. Just to give you one example of how this might work, so we can take the example of Uber drivers. A driver for Uber uses their phone as their primary interface with the organization. And the phone has a number of capabilities. It can track things like location, obviously through GPS. It can also use the accelerometer in the phone to track safe driving behaviors. For example, if you press on the brakes too quickly and you decelerate too quickly, the phone can recognize that. It can also use the microphone and the camera to capture everything the driver and passenger is saying. And what can this data be used for? Well, it can be used benevolently to resolve incidents. So if there is some dispute between a driver and a passenger, the record can protect the driver from an unfair accusation. It can also be used to improve the driver's performance by giving them feedback about their strengths and weaknesses. And it can be used to gather data to potentially train an AI to replace that driver. So from the driver's perspective, this technology can be either helpful or harmful, and it isn't explained to the driver what's happening. So the driver is left to imagine how this data might be used against them in a punitive way or in a supportive way to connect them to customers. Another example is electronic proctoring of students who are taking exams. This sort of technology is reviled and hated by students because it is invasive and creates this sense of lack of trust. It says, I don't trust you not to cheat, so I will watch you to make sure that you're not cheating. And I've done some research on electronic proctoring in the past, finding that it absolutely increases the sense of pressure people feel in a high stakes assessment and is a source of distraction. It doesn't necessarily translate into huge losses in performance on an exam, but it does create a very different psychological environment that harms the relationship between teacher and student. So I was curious about how people think about various surveillance tools, and I conducted a survey study asking people, do you think these various surveillance technologies are always, sometimes, or never acceptable? And so you see the temperature grid on the right-hand side of the screen is green is always, yellow is sometimes, and red is never. And blue, the tiny blue, is for if you've never heard of this technology. So the thing that I find interesting about this list, and I won't go through every item in detail, but when I look at this list, I see that people are very sophisticated in the ways that they think about technology. They're not categorically rejecting this. They're not categorically accepting it. They're saying that it is sometimes acceptable, depending on the purpose, depending on the context, and that their attitudes vary based on the technology involved. So a technology like tracking your heart rate, it's generally people feel that that is not warranted as a part of work performance. But if I move on to a few more acceptable technologies, so tracking which files are downloaded, many people judge that to be either always or sometimes acceptable. And the rationale is that this might involve security for the company, or it's clearly work related, and so it's acceptable. And the ways that they're thinking about these technologies are highly nuanced. Now, when I hear somebody say that something is sometimes acceptable, the natural question for me next is, well, under what circumstances is it acceptable if you said it's sometimes acceptable? So in this study, when somebody said sometimes, they were then prompted, okay, you said sometimes, tell us under what circumstances, and they were given an open response option. And so what I was able to do is classify those response options according to themes. Now, the first thing I did is take those 37 items I just showed you and cluster them. So a cluster analysis showed that we could roughly categorize those 37 items by target. The first target is behavior, somebody's movements, what they're doing, their emails. The second category is mind, kind of what they're thinking. And then the third category is the body. This is physiological measurements, so heart rate, blood pressure. And when I look at the justifications that people offered for me, their justifications varied quite a bit. So for behavior, things like my emails, people said this was justified if it was done to protect the company, or if it was done on company devices, or if it was done during working hours. But they did not feel that those justifications applied to body monitoring. So there was a sense of public versus private, and the line was that you cannot track, my physical body, even if it's on company time, even if it's job related. And I think that's really interesting. The most important justification for body monitoring is to keep me safe. Easy examples of that would be applying a radiation detection badge to someone who's working near radiation that warns them if they've had too much exposure, or a camera that looks at a truck driver's eyes to see if they're getting tired and warns them that it's not safe to keep driving. Those are the kinds of justifications that people offered. However, this data were collected in 2019, and I think things have changed quite a bit in the last 2 years. So the next step I conducted with this study was to contact these people again, the same people, in 2021, to see how their attitudes have changed. And so first, I'll just show you their overall change. So here are the average acceptability ratings on a scale of 1 to 3 for mind, body, and behavior monitoring. And this is the 2019 data. Here's the 2021 data. You can see that they're roughly the same, although body monitoring has slightly increased and behavior monitoring has slightly increased in acceptability. The body monitoring is not hard to imagine why that might be. It's because of temperature checks related to COVID safety, I think. And the behavior monitoring, I think, is related to the increase in remote workers, but this is just idle speculation. I also repeated the analysis of people's justifications, and here we see really dramatic changes. So here are behavior justifications in 2019 and 2021. In 2019, people said things like improve my performance on work property to protect the organization. In 2021, they said, with my consent and done so transparently. So it really isn't about why they're doing it. It's about how they're doing it. Are they giving me consent to opt in and out? And are they explaining to me exactly what is monitored and for what purpose? And those justifications were almost non-existent in 2019. They became very important in 2021. Looking at body monitoring, same pattern emerges in that consent and transparency are newly important on people's minds. And like the justifications such as job requirement and to improve my performance dropped to almost nothing. And then finally, mind monitoring, same pattern. Consent becomes the most important thing. If you are reading my personal information, if you are listening to my conversations, you may only do that if I give you permission and not under any circumstances. So what this tells me is that people are sophisticated about how they think about monitoring, and the same monitoring has very different effects depending on how it's implemented and how it's communicated. But I'm presenting to you qualitative data, very exploratory. The next thing I wanted to do is do a more systematic and thoughtful analysis of some of these dynamics. So the rest of what I'll talk about today is a more systematic exploration of these themes that are emerging here in this qualitative data about consent, transparency, and purpose of monitoring. So just the sort of initial starting point here is that it seems to me that people find monitoring acceptable when they can give consent, when it's clearly job relevant, and when the target is public behavior. But things like work time and work location were not as important. And I think this reflects the fuzzy boundary of work and non-work that people are experiencing now. So the next question is, what effects does this have on people's job performance and their stress resulting from EPM? So to study this question, I conducted a meta-analysis with my students. The state of the literature on EPM is highly unorganized, which means that we needed to do some post hoc classification of studies that explored this topic, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. We were able to focus on both lab and field studies, and the outcomes that we collected data on were job performance, attitudes such as justice or job satisfaction, and stress and strain. There were two kinds of studies in our analysis. There were between study comparisons and within study comparisons. When I'm talking about the results, I'll refer back to those two kinds of analyses, and I'll explain more about those in a moment. So the kinds of studies that we included in our meta-analysis, we were very particular about our inclusion criteria. First, the study needed to include some type of EPM, and we focused on work-related contexts only. We wanted studies that measured or manipulated at least one psychological aspect of EPM, its transparency, for example, or its purpose. We needed studies that reported a correlation between that EPM characteristic and a work outcome of some sort. We needed between person comparisons, and we needed sufficient description of the EPM in order to code it. So those are the inclusion criteria we applied to our search. This initial search gave us about 5,600 results. When we restricted these to articles from psychology, management, or business, we were left with 941 studies. From the 941 studies, we manually read each abstract to determine its relevance to our study, and we're left with the final set of 102 results. When we applied the inclusion criteria I just shared with you, that led to 76 results. And I should note that in addition to published literature, we scanned the proceedings from every conference that we could think of as relevant. We included dissertations, unpublished manuscripts. We've contacted authors and asked them for new research. We read the reference list of the papers that we included to look for potentially undiscovered studies. So this very exhaustive search resulted in that total of 76 independent sources representing 90 samples and 21,000 individual participants. And this was the data set that we did our analyses on. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm happy to be interrupted if there are questions while I'm talking. I would be happy to clarify anything that I'm saying here. All right, so the coding procedure for analysis is that 4 expert raters read every study and applied a series of codes. The initial inter-rater agreement was, I would call this moderate, 76% to 90%. This somewhat low agreement reflects the very subjective nature of some of the coding judgments we were making, which is why we had 4 raters. We then met and just resolved any disagreements through discussion, resulting in a final inter-rater agreement of 100%. Given the fairly small K being the number of studies, we used synthetic construct groupings, meaning that ordinarily in meta-analysis, you're combining studies that use the exact same variable across studies in a particular measure of job performance, for example. In this case, we could not do that because we didn't have enough studies. And so we did a grouping of related constructs. So there's a grouping of job attitudes, for example. Job attitudes includes job satisfaction, justice perceptions, commitment, and other attitudes that ordinarily would not be combined together. We did this so that we could get an overall sense of the patterns involved. Now, I've alluded to the fact that the literature in this area is highly unorganized. And so the biggest task in this meta-analysis was to organize the world. We used a theoretical framework that I developed a few years ago that has 4 characteristics that describe the psychological experience of being monitored. Purpose, what is the communicated purpose of the EPM? The communicated purpose, not the real purpose. How transparently is this conducted? How invasive is the monitoring? Does it feel like it is measuring personal or public data? And then finally, is it conducted synchronously or archivally? So as I go through the results, I will elaborate on each of these categories to explain how we measured each one. So the first category in the typology is purpose. Purpose can have 4 values. So the first sort of purpose is administrative or safety. When I gave the example of the truck driver being monitored for vigilance, that's a safety monitoring. That's to protect the worker. Administrative monitoring is to comply with regulations or to just engage in record keeping, but it is not about any individual worker's performance. Okay. The second category of purpose is performance, loss prevention, or profit. So this is about monitoring workers to improve their efficiency, to identify and prevent theft, to maximize profits. And so it's probably going to have the most negative effect on workers because it's sort of inhumane in the way that they're being treated. The third is motivation, development, and feedback. So in the context of training, for example, modern training is characterized by intensive monitoring of behavior for the purpose of giving feedback about skills. So imagine being in a flight simulator and being tracked in almost every way possible so that you can review that feedback and improve your performance. This is not about punishing someone, it's about improving their skills. A step counter, a pedometer is another example of this. So telling you that you've taken so many steps per day is a way of keeping you motivated to meet your goals, and not necessarily to punish you for the number on the pedometer. And then finally, the last purpose is surveillance and authoritarian power. This is monitoring for no purpose, essentially, solely because the technology exists and organizations believe that they have the right to do it, and there is no intent or purpose behind it other than exerting power. So these four purposes are very different, and the expectation here is that the purpose should moderate the effect of EPM on worker performance, attitudes, and stress. I didn't make hypotheses for this study, but we do have directional expectations. So next I will show you the results. So the results of meta-analyses are expressed in effect sizes. So for performance-related EPM, compared to, these are all, I'm sorry, let me back up. I'll say these are all between study comparisons, meaning in this case, performance-related EPM was compared to no monitoring as a comparison group. And we see that compared to no monitoring, performance-related EPM has a negative 0.24 effect size on attitudes, no effect on performance, and a positive 0.22 effect on stress and strain. So clearly, being monitored for your performance does increase your stress, it does increase your negative attitudes, but it doesn't accomplish the goal that it is meant to accomplish, which is to improve your performance. Development-related EPM, no effect on attitudes. Safety-related EPM, no effect on attitudes or performance, but a positive effect on stress and strain, which we did not expect. And then surveillance-related EPM, no effect on attitudes or performance, but a positive effect on stress and strain. If an item is not listed here, so for example, the effect of development EPM on performance, it's because there were not enough studies in the data set that explored that effect. So these are all opportunities for future research. We included a particular effect calculation in the study if there were at least 3 independent studies that included that correlation. So here you see K 12, 5, 6, 6. The missing lines had Ks less than 3. The next category of the typology is invasiveness. So invasiveness has to do with these 4 items. The first one is the scope of what is being monitored. Is it monitoring everything? Is it a broad scope, or is it narrow in terms of what is classified? And is it specific to some kinds of behaviors, or is it sort of broad strokes? Second is the target, and the target relates to the typology, the 3 categories I showed you before: the task, the person, or their thoughts. Third is the system constraints. Is there any sort of check and balance about what can be monitored? And then finally, the target being the person in this case. Does the person being monitored have any control? A good example of control is I can turn off my video camera when I need some privacy, and that's my ability. If I can't do that, that would be classified as more invasive. Okay, so the expectation here is that invasiveness should moderate the effect of EPM on performance, attitudes, and stress, such that invasive monitoring will be more stressful, it will cause more negative attitudes, and it should have no effect on performance. So in the case of invasiveness, there were 2 kinds of studies in the analysis. There were between study comparisons and within study comparisons. The key here is whether there was a control that experienced no EPM, or whether it was comparing high invasiveness to low invasiveness, but everybody is monitored. That's the difference. So in the case of between study comparisons, task targeted EPM compared to no EPM, there was a slight negative effect on attitudes, no effect on performance, and a fairly sizable positive effect on stress and strain. Positive effect meaning more stress, so positive correlation, socially negative. Person targeted EPM compared to no EPM had a stronger negative effect on attitudes, also no effect on performance, and the same effect on stress and strain. So the conclusion here is that target is not a major moderator because we see that task versus person focused monitoring had almost identical effects on performance and stress and strain. One is clearly more negative in terms of attitudes, but they're still both negative in terms of attitudes. And when we look at within study comparisons, so these would be studies that had manipulated some aspect of invasiveness, but everybody experienced monitoring in the study, I see a negative effect on attitudes, negative effect on performance, and a positive effect on strain. So the major difference here is the negative effect of performance that we did not see in between study comparisons, but we do see in within study comparisons. So relatively speaking, more invasive EPM has a negative effect on performance. But when we compare that to no EPM, we don't see that effect emerge. The third category in the typology is synchronicity. Synchronicity can be a characteristic of the collection of data. Is it collected in real time or is it collected archivally? Or in the feedback given, is it delivered synchronously or later? So you can imagine going to a website that is prohibited and immediately receiving a warning notification on your computer that says, don't go to that website, it's prohibited. Or you can imagine receiving an email at the end of the week that says, you spent 5 hours this week on prohibited websites. That's a bad thing. Please don't do that. So one is immediately as the behavior occurs, one is at some later date or potentially never. It is not clear from the previous literature in this area whether synchronicity will have a measurable effect on performance, attitudes, or stress. And so we do not make expectational predictions here. But because a number of studies in the literature did measure synchronicity, we included it in the analysis. And so I'll show you here what we found. So all of the studies in this part of the analysis were between study comparisons. And so what we see is synchronous collection versus no EPM has a negative effect on attitudes, no effect on performance, and a positive effect on strain. Asynchronous collection has no effects on anything. And so what we can conclude is that synchronicity does matter. It does seem to moderate the effects of EPM on attitudes and on stress, such that synchronous collection is more stressful and less desirable than asynchronous. And this was, I mean, as you can see from the case here, this was one of the analyses that had more data points. And so I feel relatively more confident in this assessment. The fourth category in the typology is transparency. Transparency is unidimensional from high to low. And the expectation here is that transparency should moderate the effect of EPM on performance, attitudes, and stress. Transparency meaning what information is communicated about what is being monitored, what is, how that data is being used, what are the consequences of the data collection. These are the sorts of things that can be either transparent or not transparent to an employee. Perhaps as expected, transparency has a positive effect on attitudes. I think the positive effect here on performance was less expected to me, but it's still nice to see that the message here is that communicating transparently about what's happening has a positive effect on performance, probably through the effect of the positive attitudes. So to summarize these findings, the communicated purpose of the monitoring does not appear to matter much. So what you tell people you're doing doesn't carry a lot of weight compared to your actual practices, right? So the culture of trust and suspicion that can either exist or not exist is much stronger a signal than what you tell people you are doing in a particular context. So if I say, oh, no, I'm not monitoring you to punish you, I'm just monitoring you to help you. But then I look around and I see people being fired over the contents of their emails, that's the information I'm going to pay attention to. Invasiveness has a clear negative effect on work outcomes, that maintaining a sense of privacy and private space is very important. And when the monitoring crosses that line, it creates a negative cycle of behavior. And I'll give you an example of what that might look like in just a moment. Finally, based on limited data, asynchronous and transparent EPM seems to be preferred, which is not surprising, although I think more data would be helpful here in determining exactly what's happening. Overall, though, there's a very important finding here, which is that EPM is not a variable. It's a technique, it's a method, it's a technology, but it's not a psychological variable. The psychology of how it's implemented matters much, much more than the technology itself. And that's a message that is very important to remember when we conduct studies of this nature. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that that invasive EPM can lead to some negative behaviors through a cycle of mistrust. And I want to walk through what that might look like. So in a separate study, this is not part of the meta-analysis, in a separate study, I tested a model that began with invasion of privacy as a precursor to a reactance sensation of feeling that your autonomy has been violated and needing a sense of needing to restore your autonomy. What restoring your autonomy looks like in the context of organizational behavior is in discretionary performance behaviors. So if I'm feeling upset about how I'm treated, I'm not going to sabotage my work performance because there are consequences for that. But I can withhold some of these behaviors on the screen here that are discretionary. So I can choose not to put in extra effort. I can choose not to help a new coworker. I can complain about the organization when I go home at work. These are all not part of my job description, but still end up harming the culture of the organization. They harm the organization itself. So I've classified these discretionary behaviors here according to whether they're positive or negative, and according to whether the target is a person, an individual person, or the organization in general. So helping a new coworker is targeted at one individual and it's positive. So withholding the positive behavior would be the way that you're acting out in this case. So I tested this model separately for these 4 kinds of outcomes, and the model explained 5% of the variance in positive person-focused behaviors. So meaning when people felt a sense of injustice related to autonomy restriction, they retaliated by choosing to not help new coworkers and not treat others with courtesy. But that's a fairly small effect size. 5% of the variance is very small. When we go around the rest of the quadrants here, that same model explained 11% of the variance in these items like repeating a rumor about a coworker, sort of negative person-focused behaviors. We could keep going around. 18% of the variance in negative organization-focused behaviors, and 22% of the variance in positive organization-focused behaviors. Meaning the way that people are acting out is by withholding the sort of extra effort and contributions that make the organization thrive. And it's very difficult to detect. You can't tell that someone is choosing not to contribute new ideas in a way that you can tell that they're perhaps, shirking their job responsibilities, but it is obviously harming the organization. And so this is what we see. We see when people's sense of justice is violated, they seek to balance that justice using the only mechanism that they have available to them. It's also noteworthy here that it's organization-focused behaviors and not person-focused behaviors. This suggests a sort of rationality to me that it's not individual people that are surveilling them or invading their privacy, it's the organization. And so the organization is the target of the retaliation. So if I had to capture kind of what these findings tell me, they tell me a few things. One is that electronic surveillance acts as a strong cue about what is important and an unstated goal that changes behavior and changes the psychological contract. Any target will be very motivating. And when you start implementing electronic surveillance, it becomes a target to aim for instead of what it was intended to be, which is a metric of performance, right? It becomes a way that people game the system and attempt to maximize these metrics. I mentioned the step counter earlier as an example of a motivating monitoring technology. The problem is that if you start conceiving of your entire health as being captured by the number of steps you take, then you do all sorts of unhealthy things like, eat bad food and don't exercise in other ways, but you're maximizing your steps, and so you still feel good. Or maybe you attach the step counter to your dog and let the dog run around so that the numbers go up, but it's not really telling you anything anymore. That's what can happen with these technologies when people start changing their behavior to appear good on the numbers instead of actually being good, actually taking risks and making mistakes, the things that lead to real innovation, but can show up as negative numbers if I'm just counting productivity. Okay. So what comes next? I have 3 predictions. One prediction is that these electronic monitoring tools will only become more popular and potentially replacing human managers or working with the human managers as a human AI team. I think worker privacy is already well on its way to becoming a luxury good unless it's regulated and protected. And in the US, it is not at all. Which means that the workers with the least standing, the least power already, the ones who are already exploited, are going to be even more exploited, and people can pay to have their privacy protected. And finally, all of this incidental data collection, people call it data exhaust or whatever else, the ways that we have to store and protect this data are very rudimentary and insufficient. And people are not thinking about the potential consequences of this data collection. And we're seeing the consequences of that in all of these data breaches and harms. And I don't think I need to elaborate on all of the ways that we're seeing this harm individuals. I like to tell people that I study the future of work, which is a very broad topic. One thing that I want to communicate to people is that it's very difficult to measure the most human parts of work, which means that when we collect data to train AI models, that data is going to be very limited and biased. And we need, when we use these surveillance tools to collect data, we need to think about what is the rationale, what are the consequences, how is it changing individual behavior when we do these data collection tools? I mean, these are individual human beings who are not passive in this exchange. They are reacting to the data collection and changing their behavior accordingly. And that's going to be really essential to understand when we make models of work. So I do want to wrap up, but before I do, I'll just mention something about my recent day-to-day life. So I've been working as a program officer at the National Science Foundation. And as part of my role there, I am on a team called the Future of Work at the Human Technology Frontier. And this is a really interesting program with lots of opportunities for international collaboration. It is a convergent program about the intersection of future work, future workers, and future technologies. And there's a strong need for people with expertise in psychology to inform the ways that technologies are used and developed. And that's my role on this team. The goals of this program are to understand human technology partnerships, design new technologies that support humans instead of replace them, and to illuminate the socio-technological landscape that is emerging so that we can understand the risks and benefits of new technologies like the ones I've been talking about today. Finally, fostering lifelong and pervasive learning and understanding the impact of AI on workers and work. So it's a very broad program in terms of scope. We fund lots of different kinds of projects that are led by social scientists, as well as behavioral scientists, as well as engineers, designers, computer scientists. It's a very rich multidisciplinary environment. This is the website for the Future of Work website if you're interested in learning. I think it's really interesting to read some of the projects that have been funded in that area. And so with that, just quick plug for NSF, I will stop and look forward to questions and discussion with a very grateful acknowledgement to my co-authors. Thank you.